Welcome everybody to Junction Reads. It is April 10th, fully springtime out there with the sun, and I am so excited to welcome Stephen Henighan back to Junction Reads for a very different reading. We aren't in person, we aren't sitting with a beer in front of us and enjoying the company of others. But here we are. I'm excited to talk to you about The World of After. It truly was a literary journey for me as a person who loves research. Being able to live at Oxford University in the 90s for a week or so was fantastic. Before we officially get started, I hope I would like to share a land acknowledgement. Anyone else who's not in Toronto, feel free to acknowledge where you are, either in the chat or just personally. Junction Reads exists in Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wendat Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I am specifically in Adubakok, the place of the alders in the Michi-Saagiig language. Both are still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. Stephen Henighan, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in Guelph, and that's also part of the traditional Credit and Mississauga people's territory. Just mention that, but
Thank you.
And I'm here with The World of After, but I've also been doing reading of my own recently. I haven't been doing a lot of reading sort of freelance because I actually got the opportunity to teach a graduate course this semester. So I've been reading and rereading the 6 novels I was teaching.
Right.
Now, the graduate, it was on the current or contemporary Latin American novel, sort of the last 10 years. So
Right.
A lot of the ones that haven't been translated into English yet, but there's one that is available in English, Valeria Luiselli, and in Spanish, it's called Los Ingrávidos, which means the weightless people. But in English, it's called Faces in the Crowd. And it's not as well known as the novel she wrote in English about the children crossing the border from Mexico into the States. But it's a fantastic book, Faces in the Crowd. And it's only about 150 pages, and it's got 4 narrative streams, all about Mexicans in the United States. It's really 2 narrators, but there are 2 streams for each one. There's a central narrator who is a young Mexican woman working as a translator in New York just after the year 2000. And then there's a second stream when she's a woman probably in her mid-30s with 2 children in Mexico City. And then there's a second 2 more streams that refer to a poet named Gilberto Owen, who actually was a historical figure, a sort of minor avant-garde figure of the 1920s and 30s and 40s in Mexico. And there's one stream when he's living in New York in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and meeting all the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. And then there's another stream when he's working as a minor diplomatic post in Philadelphia in the 40s, and he's about to die. And these 4 streams get shuffled. It sounds confusing, but it's actually very amusing and readable and witty. And yet I've now read it 4 or 5 times, and I keep seeing different things I hadn't noticed each time I read it. So Faces in the Crowd is my recommendation.
That is incredible that all of that exists in 150 pages.
Yes.
That is honestly aspirational, I feel.
Yes.
Just thinking about it. I'm excited to hear you read for us from The World of After. Before I do that, do you mind if I share your biography with everybody?
Sure, go ahead. I may learn something.
Stephen Henighan spent his early childhood in 4 different countries before moving to Eastern Ontario at the age of 9. He is the author of 5 novels, 4 collections of short stories, and 4 books of essays. For his fiction, Stephen has won the Potter Short Story Prize, a McNally Robinson Fiction Prize. For his nonfiction, he has been a finalist for the Governor-General's Literary Award, the Canada Prize in the Humanities, a National Magazine Award, and a Western Magazine Award. His work has been published in Ploughshares, the Globe and Mail, Geist magazine, The Walrus, and many more. He has translated novels into English from Portuguese and Romanian and is the general editor of Biblioasis International Translation Series. He is currently a professor of Spanish and Hispanic Studies at the University of Guelph, which is where you're joining us from today.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled. I can't
Thanks
wait to hear what you've chosen.
So, all right. So the novel is narrated by Kevin, who is a Montrealer from a sort of lower middle class bohemian background, who ends up at Oxford University in the 1990s. He's probably a bit out of his depth. The academic side of it doesn't go very well for him, but he establishes some intense friendships there, particularly with Leon, a Londoner of sort of whose ancestors and parents are sort of Jewish communists, and Alex, who has grown up in Toronto as the son of a defector from the Soviet Union. So these three bond over a number of issues, but one of them obviously is Eastern Europe. And the war in Ukraine has brought this 1990s Eastern Europe back to me very sharply in the last 5 or 6 weeks. And some of the things that actually are discussed in the novel now seem maybe more relevant than they did 6 months ago. The three friends argue over the very weak government of Boris Yeltsin that introduced capitalism to Russia as a kind of corrupt mafia form that turned Russians off both capitalism and democracy and made them embrace Putin. And then there's the war in former Yugoslavia comes in the latter half of the book. And so because of all this is going on at the moment, I thought that I would read a section that is set in Moscow in the 1990s. This section actually isn't narrated by Kevin. It's one of the very few sections that isn't narrated by Kevin. It's a letter sent to him by Catherine, who is his partner at the time. She's sort of an odd character too, in that she's an American who grew up in Eastern Europe, mainly in Moscow, and who harbors a kind of strange contradictory nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And she's in Moscow to do her doctoral research. And by this time, Kevin's Russian-Canadian friend, Alex, has actually dropped out of university and has ended up in Moscow as part of that mafia capitalist clique that I was talking about earlier. And so eventually the two of them meet. And this is Catherine writing to Kevin. Today I was walking through Moscow, lost in my own thoughts, when I opened my eyes, and I wished I hadn't. The inequalities are so glaring now. The Russians have always suffered, but there used to be a spirit of sharing the hard times. In the Soviet Union, there was nothing like the mafia restaurants I see now, full of frightening looking rich men and their entourages of bruisers and painted ladies. I really think that's the best word. Here they really are painted. Everybody is smoking and scaring the waiters. Some people had privileges in the Soviet Union, like the right to travel or a dacha. But since money wasn't important, the differences were muted. I'm doing battle with an almost overpowering feeling of dissatisfaction. Visions of my healthy life in Leipzig, are attacking like enemy planes. Instead of coaxing myself back into the shape I want, not just physical, but also mental, I feel numb and defeated. The dissatisfaction doesn't extend in any way to you and me, Kevin, though I think it's healthy that I've had this time apart from you to see our relationship in perspective. My parents want me to go straight to Belgrade after Moscow, but I told them there are things I need to do in England. As you can imagine, one of these things involves being with you. I was still in a crabby mood when I met your friend Alex. I phoned him one evening and introduced myself as your girlfriend. I realized how rarely I've applied this noun to myself. Of all the men who've passed through my life, how many of them would have said, Catherine is my girlfriend? Excuse this digression, but naturally, meeting Alex as your emissary, when have I been the emissary of anyone other than my parents, has made me reflect on our relationship as a public event that alters our positions in the world, my position especially. I was thinking about this as I set off to meet him. It made me feel bogged down, resentful of my onerous role, as though I'd lost my freedom and needed to take decisive action to reclaim it. I'd spoken to Alex in Russian on the phone, but when we met, he started talking to me in English. I didn't like him at all. He's so huge that he's terrifying. He's coarse and crude, not just because he swears a lot, which I don't like, but because his English is rough. I know my English can be strange, but it was as though we were incompatible polar opposites. I got my English from novels. Alex's comes from the street. After we ordered our second drinks, his second vodka, my second tea, he started speaking Russian, and presto, we spoke the same language. His Russian is beautiful, grammatically perfect, laced with literary allusions. You can tell he spent a lot of time reading poetry. He doesn't think much of KR, but he's the first person I've met other than my thesis supervisor who has read the writer I'm working on. He seems big and tough in Russian too, but he softens when he talks about literature. I saw a tremendous sensitivity in him, even a wounded quality. I told him he was like the Russians I used to know when I was growing up, a real Soviet. He didn't like that Soviet reference, but he understood what I meant. He told me that he had moved back to Moscow in the hope of living around people like that. He was frustrated in Toronto and Oxford and Harvard because he found it impossible to write in Russian while living in English. Yet when he moved back, he felt that Russians didn't live inside their poetry the way they used to. Of course, I knew exactly what he meant. I'm very happy that Alex is your friend, Kevin, but I'm also puzzled because the part of him that most resembles you, or resembles the parts of you that I appreciate, is the part that is invisible in English. The Alex I could imagine you relating to is the Alex I discovered in Russian. Maybe, having grown up in English, or English and French, I guess, this gets more and more complicated, you have some sort of radar that I'm denied, which allows you to perceive the sensitive Alex behind the coarse Alex. Anyway, I'm glad we were able to speak in Russian, because otherwise I would have wondered why you had sent me to meet this person. It's obvious he likes you a lot. He was also very pleased when I told him I had met your friend Leon. Those dark, intelligent eyes just lighted up. Overall, though, he seemed sad and depressed, digging deeper the pit of depressing thoughts that has opened up during my stay here. The old Russian bohemianism he came looking for has disappeared. He can't imagine a place for literature and feeling in the world we live in now. I think I'm dispirited. As he said this, I saw his spirit, so sensitive and cultivated, fly up in front of my eyes and disappear into the air. I felt sorry for him in the way I feel sorry for KR. I felt our conversation had ended all of a sudden, and nothing remained but to drag myself home and fall into a pit of depression. That was when he told me he knew a couple who still lived like bohemians. Did I want to go out with them? Right now, I asked. Sure, he said. Of course, he had a portable telephone. I was skeptical and tried to tease him. And they won't go home at 11 o'clock? Hey, does that happen to you too? No, Yuri and Mitzi are like my uncle was. They're like people from before. You can imagine how eager I was to meet these people from before. Before I knew it, a chauffeur-driven black Range Rover had pulled up outside the cafe. As Alex gave instructions to the driver, I glimpsed a shadow of the dangerous mafia guy in him. I was frightened and told myself I shouldn't get into the car. It's all right, I thought. He's Kevin's friend. Then I felt tired and just wanted to go home and sleep. I realized that this was my depression trying to trick me out of having experiences that would drive it away. Once Alex got on the phone to his friends, I felt better. We drove to an old building in a district that's still cheap. The elevator didn't work, of course, so we walked up 7 flights of stairs to a chaotic loft decorated with paintings and shelves of Russian classics and Soviet editions. Oh, how at home I felt. Yuri was a painter with a beard. Mitzi taught German and did pottery. She was Jewish with very dark hair and eyes. She showed me earthenware vases she had made with delicate little Hebrew inscriptions on the sides. They had wine from the Caucasus. Everybody started to drink except for me, the teetotaler, who's always the diplomatic witness to debauchery. Well, sometimes the participant too, but without being drunk. Yuri seemed to paint full time, and Mitzi obviously didn't teach very many hours of German. I made the mistake of asking them how they could survive under capitalism. I felt so boring for having asked such a mundane question. So I started telling them about KR, and KR led us to the subject of decadent nobility. Mitzi said that the difference between the Tsarist court and the Politburo was that the court was beset with lots of different vices: gambling, religious fanaticism, womanizing, incestuous intermarriage, thin blood, while the Politburo had a single vice: alcoholism. Yuri objected that alcoholism was an authentically Russian trait. Alcohol nourished the Russian soul. The only good thing about the Politburo was that they were alcoholics. Gorbachev wasn't a normal person because he didn't drink. If he had drunk, he would have been more trustworthy. They were starting to sound like normal Russians, excusing Yeltsin for his failings because he was a true Russian soul, when Mitzi said that she felt nostalgia for the nobility. Before I knew what was happening, we were planning to go to one of the 19th century estates that were absorbed into the city as parkland. For a lot of the 19th century, there were no public theaters in Russia, so the nobility went to estates on the edge of the city, like this one, to see plays or go to the opera. It was 2 a.m, and there I was with 3 crazy Russians. Once you hear Alex speak Russian, you'd forget that he's Canadian. Tatiana Alexandrovna, my hostess, had probably already phoned my parents to tell them I was dead. I knew I should go home, but I told myself that if this was the Moscow life I was missing, I couldn't very well refuse it when it came along and swept me away. Alex phoned his chauffeur, who amazingly was still awake and even sober when he arrived, and we drove miles out into the suburbs. The mansion in the middle of the park had belonged to a member of the court. We walked through the shadows and the darkness, laughing and quoting poetry. I would have been worried about our safety, except that Alex had brought his chauffeur, who I realized with a chill was also his bodyguard and a rather dangerous person. He stayed a few steps behind us and was vigilant and ignored our conversation, which probably sounded silly, however much the Russians may appreciate drunkenness. We came out of the trees and there was a small lake. The moon ebbed over the surface of the water. It looked fantasy-like and timeless. I felt I was in the park with KR, with Pushkin, with the spirit of Russian literature, of which Alex and I were 2 of the last emissaries. I felt uplifted to be an emissary for literature, just as I felt a certain novelty of being your emissary. Anything but an emissary for my parents. Next to the bushes on the far shore, I saw the shadows of swans docked for the night like schooners with their beaks folded into their breasts. I said something half-baked about swans and transcendent beauty, and then Mitzi shouted, "We must become the beauty!" Before I knew what was happening, she and Yuri were taking their clothes off. I hadn't skinny dipped in years, but the idea was irresistible. The water would be cold, but so what? Didn't I always say I preferred a quick plunge into cold water? For a second, the sight of Yuri and Mitzi running past me naked paralyzed me. They were both enviably slender. Alex and I avoided looking at each other. Then I thought, isn't this the Bohemian life? Their shouts flew over the water and through the trees and resounded off the balconies of the mansion with a faint echo. They might have attracted who knows what sort of gang, but our security guard, ex-KGB obviously, was standing watch beneath the trees. I took my clothes off and jumped into the water. Oh, it was cold. I shrieked as loudly as Mitzi. Alex, very deferential and gentlemanly, avoided looking at me as I ran towards the water. He moved along the shoreline to where a bush grew close to the lake, stepped behind the bush, undressed with movements that made him look gangly and uncoordinated in a way I hadn't noticed before. He jumped into the water. A curve of white caught the moonlight. Let's say that Alex wasn't as skinny as Yuri and Mitzi. I can report evidence of a belly. I saw something else too, but I'm not telling about that. We splashed and howled in the water. Alex was more restrained, less comfortable than the rest of us. To help him relax, I quoted some Pushkin. She dreamt of portents. She walked across the snowy plain. That's the best I can do for an English version. You can't translate Pushkin without abusing him. Alex picked up where I'd left off. There came a furious, boiling, heaving main. It was like magic. The verses sent me sailing into winter. I saw how the park and the mansion would look during a Russian winter. The poetry created the reality. When we got out of the water, we were all more subdued. They were sober, and I was at peace with myself. We were closer than we had been before. It's fun to be wild together, but wildness implies a distance. Silence can bring you together, which is something Russians understand and Westerners usually don't. I jumped up and down on the shore to dry myself. Mitzi took my hand. Softly, my little one, take your time, take a walk. We walked naked through the park, hand in hand, with the men following us and the security guard following them. Mitzi had a curlicue tattoo on her thigh. It struck me as weird and un-Russian. The moon felt cold then as my body dried. It seemed to be sending us a the moon felt cold then as my body dried. It seemed to be sending us a discreet warmth. We stopped in a clearing and dressed, the women facing the men. I'm normally so shy. I know you won't believe that, but it's true. I couldn't believe we were doing this. Alex looked at my breasts with appreciation. That's what I felt, not lechery, but a male animal appreciating the qualities of the female. I respected him more because he didn't look away when I noticed he was looking at me. And in that way too, he's deeply Russian and, sorry to say so, Kevin, not at all Canadian. Once we got back in the car, it was clear the evening was over. The guard turned into a chauffeur again. We were silent as he drove us back to our apartments. Contrary to my fears, Tatiana Alexandrovna didn't blink an eyelid when I came in at 4 a.m. Why should she? I was living a normal Soviet life. Thanks very much.
That's so great. I'm glad that you chose to read that letter. That letter of anything any interaction with Catherine made me convinced he was going to fall in love with her and that there was going to be that she was going to be the one. But
that doesn't happen either. Yes.
Who knows what the future holds? What's interesting about Kevin in the book is the chaos. I feel that he is just chaos. His relationships with women, his sexual drive, his emotional detachment, but also needing to be attached. Did you think about, and having the backdrop, this historical backdrop, which in and of itself was chaos, did you think about Kevin in that place, or did you think about the place and drop Kevin into it, if you know what I mean?
Yes. Okay. So that's a really interesting question, actually. At a sort of, I'm going to start with the sort of more personal side and work up to the more theoretical side. The more personal side is Kevin is my chronological contemporary,
right,
but is very different from me in that he's a sixth generation Montrealer. He's more sort of, he's a little less middle class than I am. He is not an immigrant as I am. And whereas I went to Oxford and was very serious and worked very hard and got, as somebody doing a PhD at a somewhat late stage of life, I knew I had to do it and get a job. He ends up in a situation that I saw a lot of other people in, which was they simply weren't prepared for the place. And there weren't very many support mechanisms. And so they either ended up dropping out or they spent years and years trying to finish their theses. So he was very much based on a kind of maladaptation to the place that I saw a lot of. But I also I think we discussed a little earlier about how there were many drafts of this book, and the first one was over 800 pages. And it took me 9 years to trim it down to about 400 pages. And then actually, oddly, the publisher said, I think it's a little short. You just need to add 25 pages, which there was one specific area that wasn't developed sufficiently, and he was absolutely right. Once I started working on it and rewriting it, I realized that what I was really writing about was the chaos of the 1990s. And the 1990s I see as the kind of long 1990s. And that's an expression, there's that, I haven't actually read this book, but everybody quotes it so much that you hear it, the long 19th century. This is the historian Eric Hobsbawm has this idea that the 19th century is an unusually long century. Because
Right.
it really begins in 1789 with the French Revolution, and it ends in 1914 with the First World War. So it's an unusually long century. And it seemed to me that the 1990s was an unusually long decade, or at least a little bit longer than average, because it starts in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it ends, well, who knows when, but one possibility might be 2001 with the September 11th attacks, but you could even extend it a bit farther. And that during this long 1990s, we've broken out of the Cold War, and there seems to be a possibility for a world of greater multiplicity and diversity to emerge. And of course, we all know that didn't happen, and we broke up into other types of bipolarism between, you know, the West and the Arab world, between the West and China and all the rest. So at a personal level, it struck me that it was a time when a lot of experimentation was possible, and when in fact a lot of direction wasn't even that easy to find. Now, my perspective on that is very much shaped by the fact that I spent all of the 1990s in the UK and Western Europe. So it might have felt different had I stayed in North America during that time, but that was the way it came across. And so that was what I was working with this idea of experimentation. And in fact, I was drawing on a now forgotten novel, a writer named Richard Hughes, who was a Welsh writer who died in the 1970s or 1980s. He wrote one very well-known book called A High Wind in Jamaica, which is a kind of sea story about children gone astray. But he, at the end of his life, he tried to write a trilogy about the time between the First World War and the Second World War. And the second volume of the trilogy, which is called The Wooden Shepherdess, has a character who's very much kind of wayward. It's the 1920s, and nobody quite knows where they're going. The First World War is over, but you can't go back to the Victorian world.
Right.
And so I think a bit of that crept in also. This idea of the 1990s as a time of experimentation and chaos, and also a certain energy, because things have been unleashed. And Kevin, as someone who, prior to his move across the Atlantic, was working for a kind of small left-wing think tank, was very much involved in the idea of this bipolar East-West Cold War world. So when it springs open, he's got lots of energy, but not quite sure where he wants to go with it.
Yeah, and there's the thing that I found funny at the beginning of the novel. This division is happening, and everybody at the university, it's like anytime they're introduced to somebody or anytime they meet a new person, the question is, are you left? Like, where?
Yeah. Well, it's also that
it's
set in a college of Oxford that has a reputation. Most Oxford colleges are extremely conservative, but there are a couple that have reputations for being the place you can go if you want to go to Oxford, but you're a bit more liberal or left-wing.
Right.
So it's set in a college that's modeled on that kind of idea.
Yeah. And all of the characters, the Canadians, and as you said, they're either on the road to success from the minute they get there, or they are not. Like, Decibel Doug, for example, a character who just immediately begins to fail because he's has had an identity crisis and doesn't think that he.
And it's kind of a self-confidence crisis. And in a way, he and Kevin loathes Decibel Doug, but he loathes him precisely because they're actually somewhat similar in that they haven't come there from, Upper Canada College or McGill or Harvard, right? They've come there from much more modest backgrounds, and so they're much less adapted, and much less able to adapt. Perhaps.
Yeah, and everybody at Oxford assumes if you're from Canada, you need to be friends with the other Canadians. I think it's even mentioned in the novel that you must know each other, you must be friends, you must.
Well, and the assumption is they all went to the same schools in Canada, which is not the case for people like Decibel Doug or Kevin.
Right. Yeah, exactly. and those relationships, even though at the heart of those relationships is this betrayal, this lie, this prank, this devastating tragedy, even though you would think that that should have an incredibly emotional aspect to it, I felt like Kevin, and Leon, and even Alex, as a response to that tragedy, there was this lack of emotion, like a not there,
or it's a submerged
depth,
emotion. It's a submerged emotion. I mean, Leon
right.
seems to just waltz away from it, and and goes on to become extremely successful. Alex goes off the rails, but arguably that was going to happen anyway, because we find out later there's something else that's driving him off the rails.
Right.
Kevin's reaction is one of possibly an excessively Canadian reaction of a kind of feeling sorry and guilty about it, but not actually being very emotional.
Right. And talking constantly about doing something about it.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's you can't be more Canadian than that. Yeah. Talking about how you're going to do good things, but not actually putting yourself on the line to do them.
Right. I'm such a good person because I'm thinking about coming forward. Yeah. That's funny. The history is talked about a lot in the book with what I felt like premonition almost, right? Like there's a I've got a quote from Zed, says small decisions do change large destinies, and they're speaking about this experience, this tragedy. Yeah. But in just that quote makes me think about where we are, where, you know, America was for 4 years, and whether or not there's any chance they're going to get out of where they were. And then Leon says, you know what I say? I say, don't worry, new divisions will come along and you're not going to like them one bit. The West will be gripped by some new oppressive ideology that's even more repellent than anti-communism.
Yes, and he turns out to be right.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I read that, I thought, holy smokes, when were you writing this? And what were those thoughts actually happening in the 90s in Europe? Like people
I wasn't writing it in the 90s. I started it
were those thoughts happening at the time?
I think they may have been, because there was an awareness among some people that this was kind of our 1920s. Right. It was a bit like after the First World War, and everybody says, yippee, we're out of the Victorian era, we can party all night and do whatever we want, and you end up with, you know, Hemingway and Fitzgerald drinking too much or what have you. Right. But so the 1990s, there was an aspect of that to the 1990s, I think, particularly as it was experienced in Europe, although it often was a very optimistic aspect. And specifically in the case of Eastern Europe, which is where both Leon and Alex end up spending a lot of time after their Oxford friendship shatters, there was a kind of hope that the sort of Mitteleuropa model of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, each in their own ways, had been proto-multicultural societies, and that could come back, that all these minorities that were scattered through all the countries in Eastern Europe could somehow become a model in the post-Cold War era of multiculturalism and, you know, multi-linguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies. And of course, instead of that, we got ethnic cleansing, right?
Right.
So that's, I think there's a kind of balance between the premonition of what Leon says about something else is going to come along and you're not going to like it one little bit, and the optimism that, you know, maybe we're going back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, both of which actually had really serious negative sides, but they had some positives too. Right. And I was in London, I had a kind of miserable part-time job in London in 88, 89. And then I worked there in a much more middle class job in the late 90s. And in both cases, there was a lot of reprinting of or rediscovery of writers from what you might call the Middle Europa period. So people like Sándor Márai, who a couple of whose novels were reprinted to great fanfare. And I even went to see a play based on one of them that was put on in London with Jeremy Irons in the starring role. And
Really?
so there was this, and the great travel writer, Patrick Leigh Fermor, who wrote 2 travel books about his youthful walk across Eastern Europe that praises the incredible diversity of Eastern Europe. Those had been out of print for decades, and suddenly they were everywhere, right? They were all
right.
And so those sorts of things presaged a kind of, or at least hinted at an optimistic reading of what was going to happen. But then there was always, the hovering there. There were always the Milosevic's and other people waiting in the wings to come back.
Yeah. And Kevin himself says it, right? Like he doesn't want to go back to Montreal. He doesn't know what to do, but he feels that if he stays in Europe, there's some kind of hope. Like at that time there was more
that optimism stays. That optimism persists for quite a while.
And in Canada at the time, there was the referendum and all this other stuff was happening, and he didn't want to go back to that.
No, and so it seems to him, from his perspective, that there's division at home and still a possible cornucopia of diversity in Europe. Although, I mean, eventually that would be doomed to fade, and eventually he does go back, but in a kind of miserable secondary role. But yes.
And so, speaking of hope, and speaking of well, we weren't speaking of that, but thinking about where Alex was going and where he was at the end of the novel, where do you think these 3 characters, Leon, Alex, and Kevin, are right now in 2020? if you could throw them forward, where would they be?
Leon would be a very well-known academic.
Yep.
Kevin would probably still be a cégep teacher in Montreal. And Alex I don't know if we can say where he goes at the end of the novel, since it's a small country that has actually been in the news a lot recently. But I would suspect he would still be there. The question is whether he would be alive.
Right.
Because he has committed another betrayal at the end of the novel, but a betrayal of some people who are quite dangerous. So that would be the question there, I think. And of course, aside from all of the sort of cultural perspective I tried to bring to it, there is just the basic exploration of male friendship in all of its perverse and fractious dimensions, the competitiveness and the also the ability to commiserate at times, and even a kind of almost a sort of semi-homoerotic side at some points between Kevin and Alex. So
and centered on that the person.
Centered on. There are a couple of ways it comes out. Yes. So
I sort of felt
that kind of thing. Sorry.
I sort of felt among them, and again, I don't know if it's just my gendered perspective, but I sort of felt that among the group of men, not just Leon, Alex, and Kevin, but among the people who drop in, there was this kind of obligatory conflict, right? Like a need to argue, a need to debate, a need a need to clash as a way of bonding. Which
that could be, yes, and that's of course very, very Oxford. I mean, that's sort of the repartee and debate around in the common room and all that sort of thing. And it is, and of course, that is traditionally a rather misogynistic, male-dominated order, right? So that's possible. I mean, it is. I tried to keep the intellectual discussions to a minimum, but at the same time, one has to acknowledge that these are the three central characters are PhD students at Oxford, so they are intellectual people. However, wildly they go off the rails at some point. But
yeah, and they themselves are perpetually living in an argument, right? Their theses are.
Well, and what's going to happen next is sort of the argument, and that becomes both a larger, maybe historical, political question, but it also becomes an intensely personal question. And where do you go? And that's, I think, true of some of the other characters also.
Yeah, well, I mean, the I can't remember his name. Becken, who's the nasty professor?
Oh, the dean.
Becken.
Yeah. The Bessborough, Dean Bessborough.
Bessborough. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that as an icon of hypocrisy, right?
Yes, like, he comes straight out of Evil and War. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, but a lot of the women are also somewhat conflicted. I mean, you've got Kumiko, who is from Japan and has become the first woman to ever get a PhD in history from Oxford. Yeah. And yet she knows that because she's a Japanese woman, no one in England will ever hire her to teach Victorian England, right? And she knows she has to go back to Japan, whatever her feelings about that may be. Yeah,
and I thought that was interesting when she wrote the email to Kevin saying, "I'm now Japanese."
Yes.
That she'd gone home and she's like, I'm back to being Japanese.
There's no
I've got married.
These intermedial identities, these sort of liminal in-between identities are only possible in certain circumstances, often when you're abroad. And so and that's something else I was exploring. I mean, it's something I've explored in quite a lot of my fiction, actually, that way in which other identities can emerge when you're out of context.
Right. Or in a different place than you should be.
Yes.
I want to invite everyone else who's here tonight to ask some questions. You can put them in the chat, direct them to Kaylee and she can ask on your behalf, or just put them in the chat and we can pull them up. We talked about, I have a question about the length, and I'm hoping that you'll go into specifics about how you got here, how you went from 800 pages to 400 and wherever we ended up,
465, I think, roughly. Yes, right. Yeah.
And how physically as a writer, this is a 100% selfish writer question.
No, that's okay.
I just want to know physically how you treated that revision and how you knew what to take out.
So I was very lucky in that the novelist John Jantunen was then living, who publishes novels with ECW Press, was then living in Guelph, and I gave him the 800-page version, thinking he wouldn't read it. And he did it.
Was there a $1,000 bill slipped into the
No, he actually just did it. And he scribbled incredibly. He's a very manic sort of person, and he scribbled incredibly disparaging comments over pages and pages, saying, "This is BS. Why is this taking so long?" Things like that. And so that helped a lot. And so I took that, and then I just went through the whole thing, looking at those comments and cutting and cutting and cutting. And so at some point, I got it down to about 550 pages.
Right.
And then I printed it out again and let it sit for another, 6 months or a year. And then I went through it and stroked out and stroked out and stroked out and went back again and again. And so for me, it's just editing, printing, scribbling on it, retyping, printing, editing, but also taking breaks. I mean, I'm always working on about 5 books at once, and none of them and I usually have the feeling that most of them will never be finished. And so it's good if I go away and work on something extremely different.
Mhm.
And then I come back and certain problems jump out at me much more clearly than they would have done had I just left it.
Yeah. And it was fascinating to me when I read that it was that long at the beginning to think about um, Path of the Jaguar and
Yeah.
um, Mr.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh's book. Like they're only 200 pages,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Yeah, my
know,
two
almost
yeah,
novella length, and then
yeah,
and the short stories. So for me, it was
yeah.
amazing that you could both create a story within 3,000 words and end up with 800 pages.
Yeah, it's a bit odd, but I mean, I feel that for a long time my life was rather episodic, so that lends itself to short stories.
Yeah.
Both of the novels, The Path of the Jaguar, which was the cause of my first visit to Junction Reads,
Yep.
and Mr. Singh Among the Fugitives, are written from the points of view of people whose backgrounds are dramatically different from my own. And so I was very cautious about what I could imagine there.
Right.
And because of that, I probably didn't quite let myself go.
Mhm.
Kevin is someone who, at least superficially, I could imagine, or I feel I have more license to just let myself go imagining him. So that may be one reason why it overflowed a bit,
Right.
especially in the early drafts. Although
Yeah.
the people who've read it recently tell me that it does move quickly now that I've cut 400 pages. So
Well, there's a lot there because there's a lot happening, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
there are a lot of people populating the space at any given moment, the spaces
yes,
at any given
yes.
moment. So it's great in that way. Kaylee has a question, and then I want
Okay.
to talk to you about your tweet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we have one question from Lois. And
Okay.
Lois says, I'm so impressed with you being able to work on 5 different projects at once.
No,
How do you
sure.
manage to keep those stories in your head? Are they all very different stories so that you can keep them straight?
Okay. Nothing to be impressed by, Lois. It's because I don't really keep them in my head. I work on something until I get to a point where I'm frustrated and I can't figure out how to make it right. Or maybe I'm even foolish enough to send it out and somebody sends it back and says, this really isn't very good. And then so I put it aside and work on something else. And then I work on something else. And then I go back to the original manuscript and I read it through and I think, oh, it's so obvious that this bit doesn't work. Now, if I change this, maybe it'll get better. And so it's not really that I hold all these things in my head at once. In fact, sometimes when I go back, I really don't remember what I was working on before. And it is like reading somebody else's work. And that's actually good because it's much easier, it makes it easier to edit if
Yeah,
you
when
leave
you're
it long enough. But it does get frustrating because I sometimes feel like it takes me years to get to the end of something because I sort of have to abandon it and devote myself to other things before I have a chance of being objective enough to really edit it properly.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've opened up a file of short stories and read something and been convinced that it was actually, this must be a story that was submitted to a workshop from
Yeah.
somebody else, you know, and then,
Right.
then you read and I go, oh no, shoot, I did write this one. That's funny. Helen's asked a question. Are you ever surprised to suddenly understand something a character does?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if I'm surprised to understand, but I'm often surprised by what they do. Because I often have a story worked out and then a character does something completely different from what I was planning them to do.
Right.
Planning for them to do, rather. And that, so that's, I think, the level at which surprise comes in. And it's actually healthy, but it can be one of those things that does delay completion because suddenly the story is going in a different direction than you expected. And then you end up with you've got a whole new set of dilemmas to resolve and a plot that no longer makes sense, and you have to go back and rewrite chapter 1 because something has now happened that you weren't planning on, and all that sort of thing. So
Right.
that's the level at which I'm surprised. I don't know about I don't always understand why they do what they do. So and I often try to, and sometimes it works and maybe sometimes it doesn't so much. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Which is interesting, right? That I remember once having a conversation about character
Yeah.
and what they do and where they go and why they make the decisions that they do. And it has something to do with our own subconscious, right? Like that
Yeah.
we
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
want them to do something so that we can see what happens to them
Yes.
in
Yes.
so that it never happens to us, or so that so that it can't
Or
happen
it's an
to us.
expression
Yeah.
of something you can't really do in real life. It's the unlived life, or it's some sort of trauma or something kind of emerging in some way, but
Yeah.
one you probably don't even admit that you have,
Right.
So
Yeah.
yes.
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about your tweet, because you did say in the
What did
tweet
it-
that you wanted to talk about this. The world of after focused on international themes,
Oh,
runs
yeah.
against the grain of current CanLit, and my concerns may now seem more central than they did a few months ago. I
Yeah,
want to
it
talk about
seems to me that we've lost the international novel in Canada. And there are reasons for this, and some of them are valid reasons, but we've been very obsessed with things like the residential schools question, which none of us were taught in school, and suddenly we realized it's a significant part of our history, and so on. And but the one of the downsides of that is that we haven't actually. There used to be a kind of transatlantic novel in Canada. In fact, I was thinking about this, and I've just written a column on it for Geist, which I think is coming out in the next issue of Geist.
Oh, nice.
Because you had, writers, you had to say, everybody from Robertson Davies to Mordecai Richler to Marion Engel to Margaret Lawrence sent their characters to Europe and then brought them back, and that journey was somehow an important journey of discovery, right? And we don't have that kind of engagement with the world, at least overtly in our fiction very much, or we only have it maybe in genre fiction. And even then it tends to be elided, and it's not, and often the story is set in the States or something like that, or it's an American rather than a Canadian in Europe. And so, or in some other part of the world. So yeah, I think obviously I was referring also to the war in Ukraine, and the way I feel that we need to think about what happened in Russia in the 1990s and the way Russia was brought into not that this doesn't excuse anything that's happened in Bucha or anywhere like that, but we do need to think about the way Russia was brought into the international system in a rather arrogant way by the West, and was Yeltsin, who was probably not the most competent person, was tricked into implementing all sorts of things that were bad for about 95% of the population, who then, not surprisingly, turned to an authoritarian leader to get them out of that. So that was also what I was referring to. When this novel came out almost a year ago, nobody was really thinking about those sorts of things. And now I think more people are thinking about those sorts of things, just because it's there in front of you all the time. And
and I'm one of those people who didn't really understand the kind of political and future historical implications, if I can say that and make sense. But I didn't know that, as a 20 something in the early 90s and through the 90s. I wasn't really thinking about that. I remember Boris Yeltsin, but I don't remember feeling any sort of, the future, this is going to mean something.
Right. Well, I mean, we didn't really, although if you see, the characters in the book do argue about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, what he's doing, right? Leon thinks that Yeltsin is destroying Russia in a way that will have long-term consequences. And Alex thinks this is the only thing to do. We have to enter the world, and maybe we're not entering it on great conditions, but we have to do it. And so that debate was, it's funny, I had sort of forgotten that debate was in the novel until about 6 weeks ago. And then when I started flipping through, and I thought, oh my gosh, yes, it's all in here. Yeah. So it was a bit of a sometimes, and that's, going back to forgetting what you've written, which is one of the keys to good editing, I think, because as long as you have an emotional tie to it, you're not going to be able to do the editing that's probably necessary. But it's also true that once something is published, you forget what you've said, or parts of it. You remember it imperfectly, as you remember any.
And that I almost feel that it needs to happen that way, because it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the reader, and and it's hard. I often think about that in with the reading series, in talking to authors and having almost compelling them to relive the experience as a reader.
Yes.
And the complicated relationship you have to your book as a reader.
Yeah.
Right. And
oh no, you do. And it kind of becomes something you didn't quite realize it was, if it gets attention. I mean, and if it doesn't, then it's not a problem. But, the sort of 3 or 4 books of mine that have got a bit of attention, they've all become something that they weren't quite when I felt or weren't quite what they were when I felt what I felt they were when I finished them.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
And which ones are those?
Well, I mean, the most glaring example of that is an essay collection called When Words Deny the World, which was about sort of the impact of NAFTA and other things on Canadian literature, and made me very unpopular with a lot of people in Toronto in the early 2000s. And I have this thing on my email where I get sent a link every time an academic article is published that I'm quoted in. And I still get, I'm not exaggerating, about 1 a month where people are thrashing out arguments from that book.
Wow.
And another one is a travel book called Lost Province, which is about some time I spent living with a family in Moldova, between Ukraine and Romania.
Wow.
And that one got translated into Romanian, where it became a very different book and was seen as a kind of nationalist statement. I was quite taken aback by the way it was reviewed in Romania. But the amazing thing is, 20 years after publication, it's still selling like 15 or 20 copies a year, which I would not expect at this stage.
Wow. In Romanian?
No, in English even.
Oh,
grad students studying that period of history buying it and that kind of stuff, usually in ebook online, but still it's sort of surprising. And also where is it? Oh, here it is. The one I read from the last time I visited you. This one was, some people got quite nervous about this one, including some people at the publisher, because I was writing in the third person, but from the point of view of a Mayan woman. And then one of Guatemala's leading intellectuals happened to read it in English. And as a result of that, the book is now coming out in Spanish in Central America and Mexico later this year.
Oh, that's great.
And so while people in Canada felt that it was wrong for me to write from that point of view, people in Guatemala actually found it very useful.
Well, and it has a really important message, which I feel can also be translated from a Canadian into a Canadian perspective, wanting literature to exist in Indigenous languages. And
there's a lot about Indigenous language preservation in it. And that's an issue where Guatemala is a very interesting case for us to look at, actually. I mean, both positive and negative.
I liked that about that, but I get the hesitance, I guess, for people to fall in love with a book written from a vastly different life experience.
Of course.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation. I do feel, I was just going to say, I feel like this book you're going to get some hits from.
I hope so.
With grad students using it to write essays and argue theses, etc.
Let's hope so.
because it's full of a lot of interesting perspectives. The characters are intelligent, even when they say stupid stuff, even when they do stupid things. It really is a journey, as I mentioned before, through academia, but with people who have important things to say. I
think so. Yeah, and then out into a wider world in the second half of the book also. So yeah,
that's great. So we are going to do what we did the last time, because it was highly successful. We are going to raffle off one of the copies that Cormorant is going to is donating to us to give to one of you lucky people today, and then we are going to raffle one off in a Twitter promote the video of this event stunt, I guess is the word, stunt. And here we go, Kaylee.
All right. All our names here. All right, so our winner for today is Ana Lorena Leja, and she actually just had to leave in the last 5 or 10 minutes.
Could I make a request?
Yes.
That's my partner. She's already gone.
Okay.
So I think we should choose another person.
We can pick another one. Yeah. Well, she had to go to feed the kids, so that's why she had to leave early, in case you.
Yes.
She doesn't want to read it.
Yeah, she's like, no.
No, she's already read it. But
yeah. Fair. So our next winner is Helen or Hannah Brown.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, congratulations.
That's great. Helen, I think I have your address. I think you have won before, maybe, right?
Nope.
But anyway,
Okay.
Send me your mailing address just so that it's front and center at the top of the inbox. Thank you again, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Allison.
We will be back here on April 24th to talk with Edith Blaze about her experience being abducted and held captive for over 400 days in the Weight of Sand. I hope you'll join us. That is going to be a very interesting conversation. And Stephen, thank you so much again.
Thanks
Best of
very
luck
much.
with everything.
It's been great.
With all 5 of those books you're working on.
Who knows if I'll ever finish any of them. Okay.
Right.
Thanks very much, Allison.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you
Thanks,
so
Kaylee.
much. Take care,
Okay,
everybody.
bye.
Good night. Thank you, Kaylee.